All right, good morning, everyone. This is a meeting of the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It's Monday, April 5th at 9:30 a.m. And we have two items today. We have a minor master plan amendment for the Ashton Village area and a zoning text amendment for senior housing, assisted living. And Pam, I'll turn it to you to set us up, and Glenn, and then we'll have some general conversation about the plan, and then we'll proceed into the details of the packet.
Great, thank you. Good morning. So you're correct. We are going to start today with a review of the Ashton Village Sector Plan. And I just wanted to say that before we get started, after the posting of the staff report, I did receive a correspondence that was a petition signed by over 600 individuals that are in the Ashton area or who have concerns over the Ashton area. And the content of the petition was really just about their concerns and some points they raise about overdevelopment in the Ashton area, things they'd like to see for height, density, the design guidelines, and the implementation advisory committee. And many of those same elements that were in the petition are covered in the staff report, as we did receive testimony related to all of those items as well. So we'll be covering all of those points made in the petition, but I just wanted to alert everyone to the fact that we had received it. I didn't want the community to think we hadn't received it, but it did come in to me after the posting of the staff report.
Thank you. And we'll go through those as we proceed through the plan.
Yep. Any other opening remarks, or we can, whenever you want me to start into the report, let me know.
Well, I can try with some opening remarks, but I may, try to weave it in as we go. This is a plan that's, I think, really intended to facilitate a bit of change in one very small part of the Ashton area. There really isn't a lot of zoning change for most of Ashton. And really, we don't anticipate a lot of change for almost all of Ashton. But there is the one quadrant of, one fourth of the quadrant, one quadrant of the, I think you know what I mean to say.
Yeah.
That is, has property owner interest. And this was a good use of the master plan process, the minor master plan process, to try to have a broader community engagement about what the community would like to see there, and to see how that can be achieved through the zoning for the property. And I think there's a lot of concern about the feel of the community, the character of the community. And I think that very broadly, that's mostly what everyone wants. I think what brings everyone together is a desire to basically continue to have an Ashton that feels like a rural village, or I should say a small town. Even though it is, their population has increased, over time, and all small towns do change. Everywhere changes all the time. We do have to remember that. Small towns change, suburban neighborhoods change, urban areas change. And, Ashton isn't going to be frozen in time either. But I don't know that that's what people are asking for. I mean, I think generally we have, there has been the evolution of the commercial strip centers and so forth. So, I have met with the community on a number of occasions over a long amount of time. And I have felt that a lot of what they are seeking, is achievable readily through the design of what happens. And I think that there's a very strong interest in having a great outcome from a design perspective, because that will have a significant impact. And there's a lot of visual cues in what we have heard from the community. The presentations that I've received, there's an appropriate focus on the visual cues of the development that might come in, and that's an important intersection that people want to signify what the community, what the nature of the community is. And so I'm hopeful that I've spent a lot of time talking with the residents about some of the design ideas that they had seen from previous iterations that raised a lot of concerns. And I think we'll see some newer designs today that I think are more responsive to what community has been asking for. And hopefully that will, I think, help explain what's possible here. And ultimately, I think we can come out of this with a win-win, and proceed in that way. So I see Chair Anderson has turned his camera on, and be delighted to turn it to him for some prefatory comments, and Gwen Wright as well. And I don't know if my colleague Andrew Friedson would like to go first. Be happy to turn to you first if you'd like.
I appreciate it. I look forward to talking through the issues. Have had a lot of conversations with community members and other stakeholders, but happy to turn it over to Chair Anderson and planning for their comments here. Just appreciate, Ms. Dunn, your packet, and Dr. Orland. I think it went through the issues quite well, so thank you.
Very good. So, prefatory comments. Chair Anderson, Ms. Wright.
Well, yes, I thank you. I think you're on the right track with this idea that this is a plan like many that we see where members of the community on the one hand do recognize the upside to some change and some more growth, but on the other hand, they're apprehensive about the idea of too much growth too fast and being overwhelmed visually, aesthetically, in terms of the changing the character or overwhelming the existing or pre-existing pattern of development, and overwhelmed in the sense of the other things that come with growth, things like traffic. And this is really, in some ways, typical of those kinds of debates that we have in planning throughout the county. I think that in particular, in a place that we all recognize is supposed to maintain the character of a rural village, but still create the critical mass to provide a variety of services and amenities and raise the level of energy and focus in this specific location without not only encouraging too much or for something that's overwhelming, but also we don't want to disperse the development across a broader area. We're trying to bring some focus and concentrate development in a place so it can serve as a real center of activity and community for this part of the county. So the trick is how much can you do without doing too much? How can you make that, and these words that we use like compatibility are really, I think, a little bit unhelpful, because what we really are talking about here is what is the right combination and what are the restrictions that are necessary to maintain that character but still allow some intensification. And too often I think people fall back on things like density and height, which are very crude measures for something that we all, I think, understand the importance of making this compatible with the existing rural character of the place, but we need to be able to go beyond those sort of crude tools to make sure that what happens in Ashton is reinforcing the positive qualities that already exist while still facilitating and allowing for an economically viable path forward for some of the changes that I think most people agree are desirable. So all that's a long way of saying I think that you're on the right track. There can be, I think, a win-win here. I would encourage everybody, all the members of the PHED committee and the council who are thinking about this, to try not to get too focused on height and density as such, but what are the specific elements of development in this area that make it harmonious or not harmonious with what's there now and the qualities that people already love about Ashton. The planning board wrestled with this at some length, and we did not accommodate everything that the putative developer of most of the property that actually is a candidate for some kind of change had asked for. We did not accommodate the request for height. We put some limitations on the length of building faces along the street, for example, and included some design standards, which are designed to make sure that there are some meaningful constraints on what can be built here. But by the same token, we were careful not to be too limiting in terms of the overall development envelope, because we recognized that in order to make these kinds of projects in a place like Ashton economically viable, there has to be some there. You have to have some critical mass to be able to justify the investment. We try, and there, I'm not going to suggest to you that there's an objectively right answer as to what that balance is. I'm just urging you to be cautious about dialing back height and density too much, and urge you to think about how that fits into design standards and other things that we can do to regulate the form of development that occurs here, in addition, obviously, to an upper limit on how tall things can be and how massive they can be, in order to achieve the result we're looking for. Not just in the sense of we want to make sure it's not doing violence to the existing community, but we also want to make sure that somebody can build something at the end of the day. And that's, I think, the task in front of you.
Well, I think the word crude is a good one, because I think there is some concern that some of the development in the past may have been a bit crude. And I think the benefit of this minor master plan is that we've been able to really have a focused conversation about what are the elements that the community is looking for that to produce the character that people want. And that's why I think there's a possibility of a win-win here, because with a lot more transparency about expectations, I think we have the ability to deliver a product that people like. And when I have, talked with folks about some of the development that has happened there, the concerns were fairly aesthetic. And so I think by really elevating the conversation here about design and aesthetics, bringing it out, and then ensuring follow-up, I think there is a way forward that is going to make people happy.
Well, yes, and if I could just add to that, since you brought it up, I think that's a point well taken. If you look at what this particular builder has done just down the road, you'll find that some people say, oh, well, that wasn't entirely successful. And I would agree that some of it has not been ideal, although I think reasonable people can disagree over to the extent to which that was, within the range of what should be allowed or not allowed. But the point is, if you look at that project and you say, well, I don't think this is ideal, the question you should be asking yourself is, why is it not ideal? Is it because it's too tall? Is it because the FAR is excessive? Or is it because of things about the way the project is designed that could be changed in order to make it a better design, not necessarily shorter or smaller? And so that's the way I'm asking you to try to think about it. Obviously, there is an upper limit to how tall you want a building to be in a neighborhood like Ashton. But I think that there are other dimensions to this which can really maybe be more fruitfully examined in order to not dial back the amount of development that can happen so much that we don't have a project at the end of the day.
All right. Gwen, anything you'd like to add?
Simply a couple of things, which is that, I number one want to say that although there's a lot of focus on that southeastern corner, there is opportunity for other change within Ashton. We know of the opportunity on the southeast corner, but we have over the last several years seen some new buildings in Ashton, including the CVS across the street, which was a very big design discussion when it came in, and a couple of other new buildings in the area. So I want to just emphasize that the design guidelines and the language in the plan is important for the southeast corner, but it's important for all of Ashton. It's not just all about the southeast corner. The second thing I want to mention, and I know we'll get into this discussion, is the nature of the public realm. one of the things that is very, very important to maintaining community character is not letting the roads take over, which is very easy to do. And
One lane at a time, right?
yeah, exactly. And we've had a lot of discussion about that through the plan. We have hearkened back to earlier plans like the Sandy Spring plan that specifically required 108 through Sandy Spring to remain 2 lanes. There are special areas in the county where we have essentially said we understand what the transportation rules and regulations are, but because of character, we're going to retain less lanes and we're going to keep the character of an area. We did it in Potomac, which has its 2-lane policy. And we did it in the late, can't remember now if it was the late 80s or early 90s. When we did the Sandy Spring Ashton plan, we talked about these roads remaining 2 lanes through this part of the county. So
Well,
we don't want to lose that.
You're stealing my thunder here, but yes, and we'll get into this issue. I know we've got a transportation recommendation that focusing on, transportation. But as you say, the character of the community is going to be heavily impacted by the public realm or the streetscape, what you see, what the street environment. And there are actually few things that have a bigger impact on the character of a community than the design of the roads. And one of the ways that really signals the scale of the community that you're in is the scale of the road that you're on when you enter that community. And so, I am very partial to your recommendation there. We'll give Glenn a chance to, walk through his rationale. But all of the discussion about the aesthetics of buildings might pale in comparison to how the roads could be changed over time in terms of what the impact is on the community. So, or the character, I should say. And these are ways that I think character can be preserved that, doesn't sacrifice housing and other important social objectives. I suppose Glenn would say might sacrifice a little bit of transportation, but perhaps a necessary trade-off. But
and I agree completely. And I just want to sort of talk about the fact that there are precedents to this. This isn't the first time we've tackled this issue, right. And we've tackled small plans. This is an unusual thing. You've seen Shady Grove recently, and a number of our bigger plans. This is really like the Sandy Spring Village plan that we did 5 or 6 years ago, or like the Burtonsville Village plan that we did in 2013. We have a few of these very small plans that are very specific to a small geographic area, and they do get down into the details, which is a good thing because these areas are fragile and they need that kind of discussion. So we're excited. We think that the draft that the board approved came out well in achieving a sort of good balance, and we're excited to talk to you about it.
Well, with no further ado, Pam, let's get into it.
Thank you. So as we've already been talking, most people know that have either been watching or involved in this, the primary core of the area of the Ashton Village Center plan is that intersection of New Hampshire Avenue, which is MD 650, and Maryland Route 108, which is only Sandy Spring Road or Ashton Road, depending on what side of New Hampshire Avenue you're on. So that's context, that's sort of the core of it. And then there is residential development around that. And then farther out, there is larger residential, rural, and agricultural development land. So in the second page of the staff report, we really get into what are the plan recommendations. It's what we're here to cover with the committee. And there are area-wide land use and zoning recommendations presented in the plan. And the one that is truly area-wide for the plan area is the Sandy Spring Ashton overlay zone. And the overlay zone was created to protect certain uses and certain characteristics of development in that area. There is the Sandy Spring Rural Village Plan that preceded this plan that was done in 2015, as has been already mentioned this morning. And through that plan, the overlay zone was removed from that village center. But in this case, as the planning staff reviewed the elements of the overlay zone, what was important for it and what was important for the Ashton Village Center, they have recommended retaining the overlay zone, but modifying it to quite a big degree. And you'll look at page 2 and at page 3 of the staff report, I list out what those recommended changes to the overlay zone are. And looking at that and talking to planning staff and then reading through testimony, council staff concurs that the recommendations for these modifications to the overlay should be supported by the committee.
Okay, so preserving the overlay zone essentially is the crux of it. Is that right?
Preserving an overlay zone, but making, I would say, updated modifications to the overlay and how it works with the zoning recommendations that are made later. And we didn't receive any testimony saying that people objected to these changes to the overlay.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. The next one that is sort of area-wide is the community design recommendations. And as everyone's been talking this morning, these recommendations, are integral to creating a community, to creating a feel of a community. And they include really basic elements such as building height, massing, building widths. The ones you'll see here in this section of the master plan that are addressed as area-wide truly are at a higher level. They are generalized statements that provide direction for design. And I think that the only one that had any, there was a little testimony we received on these that came in related to the Nichols Development Company on their behalf with two comments. The first was that these broad general design recommendations for the whole area do recommend that a majority of the development be with pitched roofs so that there isn't massing that comes in with a lot of flat roofs to reach optimal height. That's why the plan recommended more than half be pitched roofs. Their testimony was asking that be deleted. And the other piece of it was something to do with what's called figure 4. It's on page 39 of the plan. And it's basically a map that shows on the left side what current existing heights are in the village core area. And it shows what the zoning heights are for 3 of the 4 quadrants. And it shows what the suggested maximum height is for that 4th southeast quadrant. It is a little confusing. And because the southeast quadrant is really addressed later in the plan, and even this part of this figure is duplicated later in the plan where it is more relevant related to the southeast corner, I would just recommend deleting this figure because I do think it spurred testimony and it spurred confusion. So,
yeah, I think it makes sense to delete it. Let the average person who's reading this plan know where to focus their focus on these issues and eliminate some confusion there because it's duplication.
Right, and otherwise the broad area-wide design recommendations in this section of the plan, council staff concurs with all of the planning board's recommendations in this regard.
Okay, I think good without objection.
Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Orland because the next section is the transportation recommendations.
Wow, that was quick. Good morning, everybody. Most of what's in the draft plan for transportation, there's total agreement with. There's a host of bikeway and sidewalk and transit recommendations in the plan. In fact, 80% of the cost of the new recommended projects in the plan are bikeway or pedestrian improvements. So I'm only going to concentrate on a couple of issues where there's been some disagreement, either from DOT or from myself. There really wasn't any substantial, or as far as I could tell, any public hearing testimony or correspondence related to transportation issues one way or the other. The first point and the major point that we'll talk about, and Ms. Wright referred to it a little bit earlier, is the intersection of New Hampshire Avenue and Route 108. This is the main intersection in Ashton. It's one where in the early analysis that was done, or the work with the community members and the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats analysis, identified this intersection as one that had traffic that was really too heavy and had long wait times and is dangerous. The growth and infrastructure policy that you approved a little over 4 months ago confirmed the current, what had been the pre-existing standard for congestion at intersections in the rural east policy area at what's called 1,350 or 1,350 critical lane volume. And so what in the final draft refers to a traffic count that was taken pre-COVID in May of 2019, which showed that in the morning, the critical lane volume was only 1,046. In the evening, it was 1,244. So the morning peak is well better than the standard. The evening peak in 2019 was better than the standard, but getting closer to it. Also in that traffic count, by the way, there were no pedestrians crossing any legs of the intersection in the morning or evening peak hour. Actually, one pedestrian in the morning peak hour while crossing one of the legs and none in the evening, and no bicyclists in either the morning or evening peak hour. So there's at least today, there's no real heavy or hardly any pedestrian biking activity there. Although I would suspect with the southeast quadrant being developed, there'll be more of that, particularly with kids living there who would be walking to Sherwood High School. They'd be crossing New Hampshire Avenue there. So it will be somewhat of a presence in the future. One of the things the draft plan did not do, though, however, which really all master plans do, is to project the traffic at this intersection. We don't, in plans, we don't look at what the current situation is. We look at what the future is, and we try to design for the future. And so I asked the staff to do that, and basically taking the information we have from that traffic count and adding two elements to that. One is obviously there's going to be some development in the southeast quadrant and traffic generated from it. And there's also another development that's underway, which I guess is not finished yet. Will be generating traffic once it's completed. And a reasonable build out of that, not just what the zoning would call for, which is usually much higher than what is actually built, but a reasonable assumption as to what that would be. And then also to take into account the fact that what typically happens is that there is growth in through traffic over time from areas outside Ashton. In fact, most of the traffic on Route 108 is generated from outside and goes through Ashton to the other side. It's not really having anything to do with Ashton. Same is true with New Hampshire Avenue, although to a little lesser degree. And they did that. So I really do appreciate the work they did. And what the analysis showed is that with the growth in, if you just take into account the growth in traffic from the approved development and the development that's proposed in the plan, a reasonable build out of that, you get very close to the standard in the evening peak. The morning peak is not a problem. It's the evening peak we're really talking about. But then you take into account there is going to be growth on the through traffic, and they assumed a pretty modest 10% increase over the next 20, 25 years, which is only, that's less than 0.5% per year in growth. And then you find that the congestion is 11% higher than the standard. And so in a plan, we try to decide what can we do to allow the intersection to not fail. Otherwise, you have a failing plan. And so the growth and infrastructure policy that you just approved basically highlights how to deal with intersections like this in areas outside of the red areas. So in the orange, yellow, and green areas, this is a green area, you have a prioritization of strategies. The first strategy is see what you can do with transportation demand management. That's not likely to work here because the density here is so low that even in the TDM bill that you approved 1.5 years ago, which set up a regime for a much heavier TDM program, that did not apply to the green areas, so did not apply to Ashton. The second priority strategy is operational improvements, things that don't involve widening the intersection. So to two things which stick out. There may be others, but the two things that mainly stick out are signal retiming and reconfiguration of the lane assignments. In other words, a lane that might be a through right turn lane might be just a sole right turn lane, that sort of thing. And that's the kind of thing you really can't predict until you really get close to actually the time of the problem. And it's plausible that that would work to be able to solve the problem. But until we get to that point, we see how bad traffic is in the longer term future, and that's really what we're talking about here. We don't know precisely what it is. But it's also plausible that it won't work, at least won't solve the entire problem. And so there should be the opportunity to actually widen that intersection by adding a lane or more. When it's only 11% over, we're not talking about it probably adding more than a lane in one of the legs, but to leave that option open. Ms. Wright mentioned the two-lane policy. The two-lane policy does not apply to intersections. The two-lane policy in Potomac and in Sandy Spring applies to sections of the road between intersections, not at the intersections itself. I mean, in Potomac, if you look at the growth in infrastructure policy, it explicitly says, it lists about a half dozen intersections where in fact turn lanes are allowable in Potomac, despite the two-lane policy. And in Sandy Spring, at this intersection, you have 3-lane approaches on 3 of the 4 legs and 4 lanes on one of them. So we've already, if the idea is you're only talking about 2 lanes at the intersection, that policy was long been violated in Ashton, and we're really not talking about that. Again, 2 lanes. It's really talking about the section between Ashton and Sandy Spring, or between Sandy Spring and Olney, not at the intersections themselves. So there are 3 places in the plan, and in the packet I identified them in italics, where it would effectively prohibit adding a turn lane at this intersection. And even as a last resort, and that's really what the growth and investment policy is talking about, is as a last resort, do that. Don't resort to that initially. And I'm recommending taking those italicized phrases out of the plan. There's actually one place in the plan which I think has it right, which is on page 46, the 3rd priority. It says prioritize signal retiming, lane movement reconfiguration, and a new bicycle and pedestrian facilities before considering any road widening to address roadway capacity issues. That's exactly what you decided in the growth and investment policy, growth and infrastructure policy, that I would recommend you go with. And so that's the first recommendation, is just to delete that the text that's in italics. There's 3 different places where they're mentioned in the packet. And sort of a secondary point, actually just maybe more important, is that all plans in the last, 10 years or so at least, have identified target speeds for roads. This plan didn't do that. And for concern about safety, the main thing to be concerned about is not capacity, it's speed. The posted speed limits on the roads between the intersections is 30 miles an hour. And this is just my recommendation. I think in an area where you're trying to really promote walkability and bikeability, it's the extent that plan's vision is to do that I think it's really more appropriate to set the target speed at 25 miles per hour, which is what it is in the core of Shady Grove and other areas like that. And so that's the first sort of pair of recommendations. And there's a couple other issues beyond this, but that's the main one.
All right. Well, thank you for recommendation. I'll make a comment and turn it to Andrew. I don't think we should allow for the widening of the road at the intersection. I do agree about the target speed. I think that would be a good idea to make that 25. But to the conversation we were having earlier, I think the primary focus for the community in this plan is somewhat cultural. It's about how to preserve the feel of the community that they have, and also how to make some improvements in some of the infrastructure. I stood with one of the community groups at that corner, and we contemplated. I don't even think there is a crosswalk actually across New Hampshire right there. I think you have to go around that 3 crossways, as I recall. But in any event, the sense of that intersection as being sort of central to the identity of the area. I think it's a good trade-off to preserve the existing footprint of the road. If it means, you know, if it does mean a delay at one point of the day, or, you know, at various points of the day, it's probably a good trade-off to avoid feeling like you're coming into a more suburban intersection. You know, one of the characteristics of older communities can be that the roadways just doesn't seem to convey as much, you know, suburbia or I think probably in this case suburbia, but rather something different. You know, it conveys that it was a road from a different time with narrower features. And, you know, I think in this part of the community, New Hampshire has actually a fairly historic feeling footprint. And so I would be loath to change that here, but let's see what others have to say. Andrew.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the target speed point, but do not agree with the road expansion point. If the overarching goal here is to find appropriate ways to adapt change to the existing historical character of the area and of the village, I think that there is nothing that would do more damage than the width of the road expanding and creating a far different feel and look. I think it would be a setback for a lot of the envisioned bikeway, pedestrian, Vision Zero improvements that are discussed in the plan. And I think, you know, the width of a building is far less damaging to that effect than the width of a road, just given the impact that it has on so many different aspects. And so I would hope that we keep the planning board recommendation for this, and it sounds like we will be on that front. I also think, you know, in the growth and infrastructure policy, the way that was handled was a vast compromise that was worked on to try to do it. And the only reason why I ultimately supported it was because the expansion of roads was placed as a distant last resort. And, one of the reasons is so that it wouldn't be used in a place like this, for these purposes. So I would hate for that compromise to be used to counter really what the intention of setting it up that way would be. I think particularly in this area, to reflect the broader goals of the plan, which is to figure out a way to adapt to change in a way that is mindful of the historical nature and character of the surrounding context and community. I think that we ought to go with the planning board.
Additional points I'd make here, I would be concerned that if we allow this language in the plan, that's what we would get in the site plan, because I think the Southwest Quadrant would be a place where they would seek to, and maybe DOT would come in and say, well, now we need to reserve some of that space. So first of all, I think there's risk that you'd get it right away. So secondly, the theory that this is needed is based on a projection of future traffic. And I don't know, like, who knows if that's the way it's going to work out. So let's see where we are in 20 years. But I think most people in the area would rather sit at an intersection a little bit longer and feel like Ashton is Ashton. So that's where I come down here. So, okay.
The next issue has to do with a comment that DOT raised, which the streets table on page 41 refers to. It basically says that the right-of-way width should not be widened, but that doesn't take into account the fact that you might want to have a wider right of way for all kinds of things, including bikeways, sidewalks, utilities. And so what they were recommending is that that it be that the curb to curb distance not be widened. And we're talking about the sections of road between intersections here. And furthermore, and what I'm recommending is actually, and maybe from your last discussion, you don't want to do this, but every other plan really for the last 20 years, including the Shady Grove plan that you're going to approve tomorrow, includes in the roadway classification table a final a sentence like this. It's a footnote where it refers to the minimum right of way, but then it says that minimum right of way reflects the minimum right of way and may not include lanes for turning, parking, acceleration, deceleration, pedestrian facilities, bicycle facilities, transit facilities, or stormwater management, or other purposes auxiliary to through travel. Rights of way are measured symmetrically based upon roadway right-of-way center line. So basically recognizing that although the plan says here's a right-of-way width, that doesn't apply at the intersections because there could be, and they are minimum right-of-way, because there could be other reasons for going wider than that, including adding lanes, but also including bikeways and sidewalks.
I don't understand this here at all. I got to say, it sounds like it says we have a minimum right of way unless there are any number of reasons that we don't want to keep to a minimum. What am I?
That's right. I mean, this is what it is in all plans. Basically, we're saying is a length of a road. Let's say a 4-lane road might say you have a minimum of 80-foot right of way. In other words, when Park and Planning reviews a subdivision, they're getting dedications. They make sure that along the section of road between intersections, there's at least 80 feet. It could be more than that, depending upon what else is needed in the right of way because of the plan. Again, things I mentioned like either at an intersection with a turn lane or with bikeways or sidewalks, or maybe you want to have separated bike lanes that require more width. Undergrounding utilities might need more right of way, more right of way for setting back the sidewalks away from the curb. There are a host of reasons why you might want to go with more than that, depending on the individual situation. It basically gives the planning board guidance as to what the minimum is that they should be required. They can require more. And that at intersections, particularly, if you look at any kind of a road or any kind of a property map, you'll see wider cross sections, intersections.
All right, but I think the intent of the plan is not really to specify a minimum. It's almost more to specify a maximum. And so, okay, I would not add this language that would empower MCDOT to push once again for widening for turn lanes and so forth. But
well, MCDOT is on the call, I think, if you want to ask them what they think about this. I think Hannah and Andrew Bossy are on the call.
Hi, I see Andrew. Hi, Andrew.
Hello. Yes, my concern is we have a comment about replacing. Oh, hold on, let me find my page. On page 98, there was a comment about not expanding existing rights of way. I think the intent is to not expand the curb to curb, which I think addresses what your concern is. My worry is just that we're not going to have the right of way for either the bikeways that are envisioned. I'm sure we can fit sidewalks, but trying to get extra space for street buffers and bikeways and other stuff behind the curb. That's where I'm worried that we're going to run short. I want to make sure that we have the ability to get that space.
Okay, so how do we ensure that without specifying something that ends up being used to add a turn lane?
So I think there are two edits that I'd be looking for. That's on page 98. There's a statement that reads, "The size of existing public rights of way should not be expanded." I'd replace that public rights of way with the curb to curb width. Then also on page 41, that's the table that was being spoken about a moment ago. That's where I think it would still be useful to call it a minimum right of way width, but the footnote could specify for side paths, for bike lanes, and other infrastructure behind the curb.
Okay. And Casey, Glenn?
Yeah, I think that's fine, but I think you should nail this down to say you just decided a minute ago you don't want to see these intersections add turn lanes. So my suggestion would be, in keeping with the spirit of your decision 5 minutes ago, it should specify no addition of turn lanes, period. And in addition, you could say the curb to curb shouldn't be widened, but we recognize we need some more room for sidewalks. I'm not sure, honestly, we need to specify that we need right away for things like sidewalks and bikeways, because we can use our subdivision authority that transportation accommodations be safe, adequate, and efficient. I'm not sure that, I think we could do a PIE or something like that without necessarily calling it we're expanding the right of way, but whatever. If you want to put something in here that says the intent is not to expand the curb to curb, but to allow bike and pedestrian accommodations, and in any case, not to add additional turn lanes, then I think that that's fine if you want to button that all up and be specific about it.
Yes, I think that's what we want.
All right. I have one more comment, but I think it's part of the Southeast Quadrant discussion, which is a pretty minor comment. I think Pam might be covering it when we get to it, but that's it with regards to the transportation issues.
If I could just check on, I agree. I think it should specify no turn lanes, but we should have the, adequate facilities as described in the plan, that we want to make sure that curb to curb is able to accommodate what is specifically, discussed in the plan. Are we going to get language that's agreed upon that's sent around and then we'll agree to it before it goes to full council? Is that the thought process on this?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So yes, Glenn, I heard you say you'll put that together.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn.
Sure.
All right, back to you, Pam.
Okay, we're now on page 7 in the staff report. These are more plan area wide recommendations that we're covering. The next section covers open space, trails, and public facilities. Within the plan boundary, there are no county-owned parks that exist. There are, however, a number of privately owned open spaces and some publicly owned parks that are at the edges or right outside the boundary for this master plan area. We have the Sandy Spring Museum property and the Northwest Branch Stream Valley Park, as well as Woodlawn Manor Cultural Park. Those are all outside the boundary. Inside the plan boundary, there are some publicly accessible open spaces, but mainly it's a seating area and a stormwater management feature in the Northeast Quadrant in front of the CVS, and a small green area of trees in front of the Sandy Spring Bank. So there's very limited sort of green public gathering spaces. The plan then makes a number of recommendations for how to achieve better public open and gathering spaces in the plan area. And in particular, you have bullets 4, 5, and 6 that are listed on page 7. With respect to these bullets, we did receive testimony again from the Nichols Development Court because they relate to the Southeast Quadrant. But they basically state that the developer looking at these has looked at and has initial site ideas for this area and will incorporate those plan recommendations for the public gathering space, the green space, the linear neighborhood park to connect it to New Hampshire Avenue, and the preservation as much as possible for those the trees that are in the green area in front of the bank. So I just wanted to note that. The only comment that council staff would make regarding these recommendations is the very last bullet, which says to designate the proposed public open spaces within the legacy open space functional master plan. I just wanted to note that typically these designations are done on a case-by-case basis, and just to soften that with consider designation of, rather than this master plan itself doesn't designate these properties as legacy open space. It's just done through a different action. Add the word consider in front of that.
Okay.
The next is a very small section on trails, and it just continues a recommendation from the prior master plan about trying to find a trail connection through the Sherwood High School property that would then link this plan area to the park's larger properties outside the plan boundary. And that would be a really useful connection for people in this area because they could get from the plan area over to the park system on a park trail. And that would just take coordination with NCPS. The plan just continues to retain a recommendation that this coordination is something that should be done and considered.
What do people do now there? Do they just walk through the school campus or something?
They might, but I don't know how well, and possibly someone from the master plan team could answer this, but my guess is I'm not sure how well it connects once you get through sort of the
Okay. So it's a bigger issue than just what's on the property campus.
developed area of the property, possibly the trail itself, would need to accommodate somebody who might want to take a bike that way. Like you know, it may be that you're just cutting across an athletic field or something.
Okay. Keep going.
Okay, the plan looked at public facilities in this area. It looked at fire rescue, police, libraries, and found that they were all sufficient to support the modest development that would occur through the rezoning of properties within the plan area. So there's really no recommendations related to changing in public facilities. They do have environmental recommendations. About 75% of the plan area is located in the lower Patuxent River watershed or the Hollings River watershed, which contributes to the Patuxent River. And so they offer up recommendations related to environmental site design and tree canopy, and those are listed at the bottom of page 8 of the staff report. And council staff concurs with all those planning board recommendations for environmental site design and preservation. At the top of page 9, you'll see their recommendations for historic preservation. Again, given the limited size of the plan boundary, there's only one resource that is designated in the master plan for historic preservation within this plan boundary. And so there are only 3 recommendations related to sort of historic preservation issues in this plan. And council staff concurs with those planning board recommendations as well.
Okay.
All right, we're now on page 9. Oh, sorry.
No, I just quickly wanted to say the pedestrian and bicycle scale wayfinding, connecting the historical and cultural resources in the greater Ashton, Sandy Spring community. I just think is a really good recommendation. Just wanted to note that. I think we could be doing more of that in other parts of the county. There's so many things that we drive past, sometimes walk and bike past that will would benefit from being denoted with some type of public notification like a wayfinding, and to create the sense of community that we're looking for. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank planning for that recommendation, and see if we can bottle that up and spread it around, because I think it's a good recommendation to have in a lot of different communities around the county, and particularly in this one, given the abundance of some of the historic and cultural resources beyond the boundaries of this plan, but nearby.
All right.
Great. Okay, so the next section we'll probably spend the most time on, the next 2 actually. So the next one are what are called the local and property specific recommendations by neighborhood. You know that the plan area has been broken into 3 neighborhoods. One is called the Ashton Village Center, is the village core, the other is the residential edge, and the third is the rural buffer. So if we start with the village core, that is really where that intersection of MD 108 and MD 350 is located. And it is the commercial areas sort of around there, commercial and residential kind of mixed. Overall, the recommendation for the village core is that the sector plan have a maximum density of 0.5 FAR, and that the zoning be changed from currently CRT zoning to CRN zoning. And council staff has no issue with that. I would just note that the current zoning maximum for this area is a 0.75 FAR, and I think in one quadrant it is 1.25 FAR. So this is a decrease, but planning staff have looked at this. It accommodates all current development, and they believe it would accommodate future development as well. The one primarily undeveloped property, as everyone's been talking about already this morning, is that southeast quadrant, which actually has quite a few acres in it. So a 0.5 FAR on that 9 acres is sufficient to provide the development capacity they would need to do mixed use and residential development on that site.
Okay, so generally speaking, this is actually reducing the allowable density, much of it, but it's making it even, and at the same time, it's sufficient for the property that we anticipate, one of the primary properties, to do something that has more architectural elements. Density is important to be able to do the better architectural design. Okay.
Yep. And so then the staff report walks through and it lists out the planning board's recommendations related to each of the quadrants. It starts with the southwest quadrant. We then have the northwest quadrant and the southeast quadrant. I listed in the staff report all those recommendations relevant to those property-specific neighborhoods. And for time, I won't spend much time on those because council staff concurs with all of the planning board recommendations for those three quadrants, the southwest, the northwest, and the northeast quadrant.
Okay, so those are basically no controversies. Can you, and they're essentially, I don't know if I would say it's status quo, but can you just give us a quick encapsulation, Pam or Gwen? Yeah.
So the first one is the southwest quadrant, and basically, as I said before, it's currently zoned with the CRT zoning, a 0.75 maximum FAR. Commercial is equal to the total. It does have less residential currently today allowed. It's 0.25, and the height today is 35 feet maximum. It does have some also R90 zoning. And the recommendation is just to change that to the CRN zoning of 0.5 that's being recommended for all four quadrants with equal commercial and residential total FARs and a height of 35 feet. And that's the same for the northwest quadrant, but currently the northwest quadrant is zoned in a planned development zone. We know that in redoing master plans, we don't recommend that planned development zones are reconfirmed. They are then translated into what is kind of on the ground today. In the village core, what is there is the Ashton Village Shopping Center. And again, this CRN of 0.5 with a height of 35 feet covers that Ashton Village Shopping Center property. And then the plan makes more recommendations related to if this property were to redevelop, how to make it a little more pedestrian friendly environment for the community and to also fit in with that village rural character.
Right.
And then the other property is the northeast property, which, as Ms. Director Wright has already pointed out, had the CVS redevelop on it in 2016. Its current zoning is the 1.25, but it has a maximum commercial FAR of 0.75 and a maximum residential of 0.5. Its height is limited today to 35 feet. And so the translation and zoning that is equivalent across this area to 0.5 with a height of 35 feet is perfectly legitimate for appropriate for what it has today. And it also has a few more recommendations, again, related to how to keep this area pedestrian friendly and accessible to the community.
Okay.
And now we have the southeast quadrant. So this is probably where we'll spend some time because this is where we did receive the bulk of the testimony for the plan. The southeast quadrant, about half of it today is currently zoned in the CRT zone with a 0.75 FAR, 0.75 for commercial, 0.25 for residential, and a 35-foot height. The other half of this quadrant is currently zoned R60, and then there is a strip of it that is zoned in the rural cluster zone. It is home to the Sandy Spring Bank branch, a BG&E substation, and one single-family detached house. Otherwise, it is relatively undeveloped. And then there is a list of the planning board recommendations related to the quadrant. They're on page 11 of the staff report, basically retaining the R60 zoning for that BG&E substation, but then rezoning the rest of the quadrant to the CRN of 0.5. And in this case, the only difference from the other three quadrants is that it's been recommended for a maximum zoning height of 45 feet. The plan also lists out, again, a number of provisions to make this a walkable, pedestrian-friendly, and accessible area, and relates to the current use of the bank drive-through on that property, and involves retaining the green space in front of the bank. You did receive testimony. So one part of that testimony came from the Nichols Development Company, the main developer in this area, who is a property owner for it, and in support of the planning board's recommendation for the zoning on the property of the 0.5 FAR and the height of 45 feet. But you also received testimony from stakeholders and civic groups, residents of Ashton, who were concerned with the 45-degree height, feeling it was out of character for the area, and instead advocating for a maximum height of 40 feet for this quadrant. And then several of those, but not all of them, who testified in opposition to the height also recommended a lower density for the property. So we're basically on page 12 of the staff report. So as council staff, I basically looked at kind of what's the current property right today. Again, it is a decrease in their density to go to from 0.75 to 0.5. The height today is really governed by several things. The overlay zone today governs height. It does have provisions for that. They are being recommended for removal by the planning board in the overlay moving forward. But today, the overlay says that you can get up to 30 feet in height for commercial development and up to 40 feet in height for residential development. That's on the CRT portion. That is on half of this quadrant. The other half of the quadrant currently today is R60. We know that doing residential detached housing in a R60 zone, you can get 30 to 35 feet in height, depending on the type of roof. But if you did optional method MPDU development, R60 does allow different building types. It allows duplexes and townhouses, and allows a 40-foot height. So that's just some context about what could be done. And basically the RC zoning, which is the small strip of this quadrant, and then it is the zoning that surrounds the whole quadrant is RC zoning, it's rural cluster. It has a 50-foot height. And a lot of that is done because these were thought to be very large residential estates, but their height limit is 50 feet. In reviewing this, council staff would definitely supports the 0.5 FAR. We think that it seems relevant. It obviously covers the density needs for the redevelopment of the other quadrants. It covers what they already are built at today generously, and seems to be enough density to cover development in the southeast quadrant. As far as the height goes, council staff recommends retaining the planning board's intent of having a 45-foot height, where it also provides sort of direction about where that 45-foot height is appropriate. So it doesn't allow the 45-foot height across the whole quadrant. It has language in the plan that says 45-foot is appropriate in certain places, interior to the site, or for a building that would be deemed a focal point of the area that stands out from the rest of the block, and that not all of the buildings get built to 45 feet. I just suggested in the staff report on page 12 some stricter language, I think, that would address the community's concern. I think the idea that a developer could point to any particular building being a focal point and could get 45-degree heights along the roadways that they see as the entrance to their village center that does create that character, those being at 45, I think is what gave them the most concern, because it did seem out of character. It seems like if you could, again, be a little more deliberate to say that the 45-foot height is just not allowed at the buildings that front on 650 or 108, and that any 45-foot building had to be interior to that quadrant, again, taking advantage of topography if possible, and if at all feasible, could help alleviate some of that character concern.
All right, so let's talk this through. I like what you're broadly laying out here, Pam, but I'm still finding it a little confusing, I think, or would be confusing for, a resident trying to interpret here. And I'd like to go a little bit into more detail about this slope issue, in the farther part of the more distant part of the property. So as I am understanding it, there is enough slope on the rear part of the property that you could have, a uniform height from the street. But if you didn't allow for more height on some buildings, that they would actually have to come down from, let's say you made it 35 feet across, let's just say. Well, for buildings on the back side of the property from New Hampshire Avenue, they would actually appear to be like 25 feet, because the building would be set below grade essentially because of the slope. So Gwen, if you,
a cross section that shows the change in height in topography, would that be helpful?
It would be helpful.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
it
don't
would be helpful if you
is
could.
that something you could pull up, or Roberto?
If you could, let's find those, and
Yes,
then
I can get that up.
Great, thank you. And then also, I think there's some new drawings that it would be helpful to show. And so generally, I what I'm trying to say is, I think we don't want to prohibit the developer from you taking advantage of the slope and allowing them to go down essentially rather than up. And I think there should be general support for the idea that the developer can go down. And in order to do that, we have to allow for a certain height. And, you know, we can talk about what that is here. So, you know, I felt like your language, Pam, is getting to that, but I also think we might be able to be even a little bit clearer or more precise about it. But let's take a look at some of the images here and kind of get into this issue.
So, Jamie or Roberto, are you able to share your screen?
Equin, we may need to provide screen sharing.
Screen sharing abilities are enabled.
Okay.
There we go. And do you want to please explain this, Jamie? You may have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. My internet connection has decided that it wants to be unstable all of a sudden. But this tool is in MC Atlas, and if you click on some spots, you can go across the site. I don't know why my screen is turned gray, but you can see the little X move across the site along with the elevation profile. So at New Hampshire Avenue, it's at 495 feet. But by the time you get to the back corner, it's 468. So there is 10, 20, 25 feet. You know, by the time you get to about right here, you hit the environmental feature. So it's about a 20-foot elevation change from New Hampshire Avenue to about where the environmental buffer starts.
And that's, you said it's about a 20-foot change. So when you have a uniform,
Yeah, you can see.
right. So the issue here to me is that if you have a uniform height, what you essentially have is buildings that are stepping down towards the rear of the property. And that would seem to be needless. I think what the community is concerned is more about the height looming over the street. And what we want is, you know, to get that right. But then I don't know that there's particular concern about allowing for the height in the rear part of the property. I mean, personally, I don't have that concern. I think imagining a uniform height across the top, although we're not going to have flat roofs, but imagining a uniform height across the top, necessitating a greater height allowance, it seems fine to me. All right, so comments. Well, anyway, this is just background, I guess. Anything else, Jamie, you want to share with us, you know, to understand this better?
Well, that's all I had was for this particular issue, was that the site does drop off. So that gives some flexibility as to where the height could be.
Right.
And not be obtrusive to a.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that the language that Ms. Dunn has come up with is actually a very good description of what the goal is, which we tried to, I think, achieve with words, but also with the drawing. Figure 10, I think it's called, but I think that the words that Ms. Dunn has developed are a good way to explain it in words.
So what Ms. Dunn says is that you can't have 45 on buildings that front on 108 on 650. Does that mean you can have 44?
No.
What's the spirit of that, you know, for you?
Well, you need to look at figure 10, because that was what we were using to try to to explain things, where it shows the bubble diagram of buildings along New Hampshire and 108 at 35, at the corner where you might have some commercial buildings going to 40, but then the 45-foot heights only at the interior of the site. And Again, I don't know if there's someone who could pull that image up. Might be helpful to look at it and see if it's clear enough. We're trying, a picture worth 1,000 words. We were trying
Okay.
to communicate it in that image.
All right. So let me just restate. The impact of that is that what many folks in the community are saying is we don't want to allow 45 feet on, we don't want 45 feet. And what Pam is saying here is, and what Gwen is concurring with, is this language says you can't have 45 feet on the frontage buildings. However, recognizing that there's a slope in the back, why not allow it in the back? And therefore, the building doesn't actually have to step down towards the rear of the property. And so, makes sense to me.
Yeah, I'd support the language as well. And I would just note, I'll let Ms. Dunn speak for her own words, but I will say, I do think he addressed the 44 feet versus 45 feet to your question, because it specifically and explicitly says to be used selectively. It
Right.
says instead of 35 feet, there is language in there to denote that 44 and a half feet, is not less than
That's what I was kind of getting at. Yeah.
45 feet. I think that the language addresses what you were asking as it was drafted, but I'll turn to Ms. Dunn.
The only, what comes to mind listening to Director Wright is he has a point, and maybe this gets at both of your comments, would be just to then make a reference to figure 10, just, that figure 10 then, is an illustration of where these suggested heights are appropriate. And that way people would be more comfortable thinking, okay, if it's not 45 interior, this figure 10 is showing that 40 is what is appropriate at the corner and 35 at the edges, so that we create that step down all the way into the neighborhood as is envisioned. I think just adding a sentence that references figure 10 near this text would be maybe the two things that make it clear.
Right.
Okay.
And as you say, your language there says the purpose of that additional height is purely and strictly for the changing elevation of the property. So it's not something that can be pulled out and applied elsewhere.
Right, and I did on page 13 of the staff report, I do have some slightly revised language then for figure 10. Again, to make it clear that it says maximum proposed building heights, and then it talks about suggested heights. Anyway, to just change figure 10 language to be suggested building heights for buildings in the southeast quadrant, where the tallest buildings must not front on Maryland 108 or 650, and where the building heights maintain a transition from the edge of the core of the village to the intersection.
Okay. Now, I just want to make a very general comment here, because I feel like I was watching this from the community perspective. I think there's a hope that we will resolve these issues now perfectly, and that will be the way that, this is a finished product. Unfortunately, it's really not the way the process works. What we're doing is we're setting a kind of general parameter, and this conversation is going to continue through the subsequent steps of a development process. And so how this will all ultimately work out is going to be determined with a lot of community engagement through site plan and other steps in the process. And I know everyone's aware of that, but I just want to say it because this is an important step along a journey here, but it is not the end. And so what we're trying to do is set a very broad parameter and then resolve it, more clearly through, or more precisely through, more refined steps in the process. But okay, great. Do you have, so that's figure 10. Do you have, is this a good time, do you think, Pam, to show some of the design,
Sure.
the improved design?
I'll pull that up. Okay, I guess everyone can see this. It's always hard to tell what people can see.
Yes.
Okay, so this was something we received from the architects for the property developer on the southeast corner. These are actual, photographs of different things that represent the types of structures that are being talked about in the plan, whether they be mixed use or wholly residential. And again, also the open spaces, the green gathering spaces. And Councilmember Reamer, I'm not sure I'm just can scroll.
Yeah, but just walk through them. Like, so, okay, that's a good one right there. All right, so this is what the developer has presented. So this looks a lot different than what some of the large building massing, from previous development conversations were that I think people were concerned about. And I think what I see here speaks a lot more to the kinds of concerns that I was hearing about the plan. It's more responsive. It's very responsive, I think, to the kind of vibe of the community that folks want. So I thought it was important to put this out here publicly. I know this is not, this is not the site plan. I'm not suggesting that it is, but I think it's important to have on the record like what we're talking about, even very broadly. And to me, this is responsive to what we have heard is what we want. And I think it's important for us to just put that out there so that it's context for the subsequent conversations that we'd have.
Right. What I'll note for you, because I think this is pretty valuable, is you'll see this little box over here. It shows that view 1 here this is along the neighborhood edge. So this is as you approach the intersection of 108 and New Hampshire Avenue. This is as you enter and along New Hampshire Avenue. And this becomes then view 2, which is just a little further along that roadway toward the intersection. View 3 is basically almost at the intersection, not quite. Down here, again, the homes are just a little larger, maximum of 3 stories. And that there is the view of the intersection, the southeast quadrant from the intersection itself, showing the trees that everyone still values very much. They're on the corner. But again, the design and massing that Councilmember Reamer was talking about, just for context to show you that they had stepped it along to indicate where these things were located.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate you showing that. Gwen, any comments here?
Just that I think we are definitely making progress, and I appreciate that you clarified that this is not a formal site plan design. We will be going through a regulatory process and we'll be getting into all of these topics in greater detail. But the goal of the master plan is to set the vision and to set the basic parameters. And we think that we're achieving that with the language that also, I think the very good language that Ms. Dunn recommended, including changing the caption on figure 10. And I think that's all good. I know we're going to be talking about the design guidelines and the implementation advisory committee. I think those are also crucial parts of achieving that whole vision. And again, the good news is that the staff who are sitting here listening to this conversation are probably also the staff who would review any subsequent regulatory approval. And so, they're definitely getting a sense of the council's direction in not only the words in the plan, but the words that you're saying.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Good. Well, go ahead, Pam.
Sorry, I was going to say, if you think we've covered that, there is one more piece of recommendation related to the Southeast Quadrant, which is this MCDOT comment. I don't know if Dr. Orland wants to get back on and discuss this one piece. We're on page 13 of the staff report. Okay,
well, before we move to the transportation element, I think we might as well just see if we're in agreement about this piece. So what staff recommendation? I can just share, Councilmember Joanna's not here with us today, but he signaled in general he was supporting staff recommendations on the items that are before the committee today. That's a proxy, but it's not a vote, obviously.
Right.
So anyway, Andrew, any comments on staff's language?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with staff language and, both in the specific language about the southeast quadrant and then the added language for figure 10. So
Good,
Okay, me too.
great.
Okay, on to the transportation piece here.
Sure, it's pretty small. DOT had another comment which refers to the two new streets which are shown in the plan, in the illustration. They're concerned about that it may render several properties undevelopable. The chart, the particular exhibit says that it's illustrative. It doesn't say this is exactly where the roads are going to go. That's fairly common in plan. It doesn't bind the planning board to approving the roads exactly where it's shown. And so with that, I don't think the concern is something to worry about. And so I would concur with the final draft plan. In other words, we don't need to make a change to that chart, to that exhibit. This is figure 7 on page 69. That's it.
Okay, those are those two orange are the local streets.
Yeah, the
Right.
one that connects New Hampshire to 108, and the other one that sort of connects that other street to New Hampshire. Again, the bottom of the chart mentions that it's illustrative, and it doesn't bind the planning board to saying this is exactly where the roads are going to go. It's just an idea. And so with that, I don't think it's a concern.
Okay. All right. So it's not a concern to leave it in there, you're saying?
Correct.
All right. Okay, sounds fine.
Okay.
I'm a little confused here. Okay, MCDOT raised a concern, and you're saying it's illustrative, so not a concern. That's
right.
Got it. Okay.
Hi, this is Jamie. I have one question. The renderings from Nichols showed some on-street parking along New Hampshire Avenue. And I'm not sure how the previous discussion we had about how the curb to curb width needs to be would relate to their proposal to have on-street parking along New Hampshire Avenue. So I just wanted to raise that as a concern. I don't
It would
have an answer.
prevent
I
it.
just had a
Actually,
prevent it. So if we want to see it, then we might need to discuss it.
well, that's
Well,
interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm looking at the rendering. I didn't see on-street parking on New Hampshire. Maybe there is. Yes, I guess way back.
Clearly, you could not have on-street parking now because it's only 2 lanes coming in, right?
No, it's actually 4 lanes once you get close to the intersection.
I mean,
It broadens out as you get to the intersection, but so it'd actually be wider than that. Depends how close to the intersection it would be. Can I just read the sentence, sort of following up from the earlier comment about the note for that table? And let me just see if, with what Jamie just said, this would work. In the minimum right of way, and I'll send this around so you don't have to feel bound by this, but I just want to get this in front of everybody right now. You say reflects minimum right of way and may not include, and then I just say right of way needed for on-street parking, pedestrian facilities, bicycle facilities, transit facilities, or stormwater management. In other words, it leaves out lanes for turning or acceleration, deceleration, but it leave open the option for parking. Is that meet what you're looking for?
I mean, I'll just say I don't know that I'm looking for that personally, but I think it makes sense for it to be an option. And often street parking can have a significant traffic calming effect, and
Right.
So it's very beneficial, I think, in general. And so we wouldn't
And
want
in a previous approval on this site had a previous regulatory approval. We did have on-street parking. It had been negotiated with state highway folks and DOT to do the on-street parking. We're anticipating that any new regulatory case would probably also propose some on-street parking.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. So good catch to Jamie. Let's add that in.
Yeah, definitely good to have it as an option.
All right, thank you. Okay,
Okay. I think we are moving on. We're still on page 13 of the staff report. The two other neighborhoods, now we are moving out of the village core. We have the neighborhood specific recommendations for the residential edge. Again, this is the area that is just outside of the village core. It's primarily residential. The draft recommends retaining R90 and townhouse floating zone 10 zones for these properties, retaining R200 zone for another property. And it has also some recommendations related to transportation infrastructure, sidewalks, things like that. And then the rural buffer is the one just outside of the residential edge. And it also has a recommendation retaining its existing zoning. And again, some recommendations related to sidewalks and those upgrades and the trail at Sherwood High School. So for both of these neighborhoods, council staff had no recommendations that would change anything that the planning board put forward.
okay, good. Sounds simple.
Okay. The next section is the design chapter. And as we've already been discussing today, design is probably a very big part of how this plan does get implemented. It is a smaller area, and so the way things are constructed and the way they look and feel is going to make a difference. This plan has included these design, what are typically called guidelines and occur outside of the master plan, has included them in the master plan, and they address things related to buildings. So you have building types, building placement, massing, you have architectural embellishments, you have building materials that are specified. You also have some recommendations related to open space and to the transportation connections here as well. And you have some broad ones as well. So just in general, I'll have Dr. Orland talk about the transportation one in just a sec, but I just wanted to give you just a sense of what these are, the fact that they are a chapter in the master plan. There was one that was very specific that you received testimony. It had to do with the building massing and the building widths and whether they should be restricted to a certain width as is recommended in the plan. That recommendation was to limit them. The plan limits a residential building up to 80 feet along one of the road or along those roadways, limits it to 120 feet width for multi-use in general buildings. And then the testimony you received was requesting that for residential buildings along the roadway, that width get increased to 90 feet from 80, and that for interior buildings, interior to the site, mixed use or general, that the width could go from 120 to 150. That's pretty specific, and we can talk about that right now in general, or we'll just segue, let Dr. Orland cover the transportation piece quickly, and then go back to this whole broader issue of design guidelines in the building massing.
All right, why don't we do that, Glenn?
Sure. The only piece that's transportation, actually you talked about a little bit earlier, it's on page 98. That's what Andrew Boss referred to. It has the sentence which says the size of the existing public rights of way should not be expanded, ensuring that crossing distances are minimized for pedestrians and that drivers do not speed. And his recommendation, which you agreed with, was to change that to say the size of the existing curb to curb distances should not be expanded. But that's the only point. So if you can retain the guidelines, this would remain in. If you took the guidelines out, that phrase would come out, like all the other parts of that design guidelines.
Right, we want to keep the curb to curb guideline, although we're now modifying that to include parking.
Right, that's true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the more general or the bigger issue is really over the past decade, almost all master plans have removed their design guidelines from the plan itself, and they occur in an appendix. They are called master plan, or I'm sorry, they are called design guidelines, not recommendations. So the council basically has before you a plan that's now decided. They think that because it is such an integral part of this plan, they should be in the plan. Apparently Governor Strathmore sector plan that came before the council in the last couple of years has done the same thing. It was a very small area, would have been just a very tiny set of guidelines exterior to the plan. They were included in the plan.
Okay, wait, so just to make sure I understand, normally design guidelines are not quote unquote in the plan. They're in an appendix. we've heard testimony from some in the community. I think the petition said, make them design requirements, strengthen them probably beyond what our powers actually allow us to do. But what you're saying is by including it in the plan, it is now a much stronger element for the board's guidance than would otherwise be the case. First of all, just as a basic context, this means that design is a elevated part of the guidance that the board has for the subsequent development applications.
And if I may add, I think there are both, there was something that was discussed a great deal about whether the guidelines should be in the plan or a separate document. And there are both practical reasons and policy reasons that the planning board decided that they wanted them in the document. The practical reasons are, and again, it is true that in our larger plans, we have had the design guidelines as a separate appendix. Usually those design guidelines are substantial booklets in and of themselves, 30, 40 pages long. And in our smaller plans, I do want to note, it's not just Grosvenor, Strathmore, the Sandy Spring plan that I mentioned earlier, the Burtonsville plan that I mentioned earlier, in all of those circumstances, the guidelines have been within the plan. And there's sort of a practical reason for that, which is if you pull it out, it's an 8 or 9 page document. It may, and I hate to say this, but 10, 15 years from now, it may get lost in the shuffle. And the staff, who would be none of the people sitting here today, will be looking at the plan and forgetting that they have to look at this 8 or 9 page appendix, if they can find it, with the design guidelines. So part of it has to do with the fact that it's a really small area and the guidelines are only a very short document. That's different in a major plan where you have design guidelines that become like a booklet of their own that people refer to and use as much as they use the master. But then the policy, so that's sort of the practical side of it. The policy side of it is that the community did want to make sure, because design is such an important part of this plan, that the guidelines were in the actual plan, because then they felt like they would really have greater attention. There's great significance that they would absolutely be used. And when we discussed that with the board raised the concern that if you do that, every time you want to change a little aspect of the guidelines, you'd have to change the master plan. So we went back as staff and rewrote the guidelines several times to try to make sure that they were broad enough and general enough that it wasn't going to be something that would, probably require little minute changes, that it was going to be something we felt was important enough that we should live with it for the life of this plan. So those guidelines became more general from where we had started midway through the planning process. And we think that they are general enough that we can put them in the master plan and not have to worry that they will be, end up having to be changed every couple of years.
Okay, good. I think that makes sense. I think that's very responsive to the community's, strong interest here. And I think, again, part of a win-win approach here. Andrew.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's helpful to me. I'm still a bit confused as to when we include it and when we don't include it. I mean, I do think that we should have a standard, and it should either be in all or it should be in none. It seems somewhat arbitrary or at least inconsistent when these are included and when they're not. I mean, I think there was, a very good effort here to try to address issues while not upending the standard process and the regular, regulatory review process. but I just am still a bit confused, frankly, on what is our approach, having nothing or only a small bit to do with this particular plan, but the broad question, if I get asked a question by a resident of when, why, and how design guidelines are included in master plans, I don't have a particularly cogent or coherent answer to that question. I don't know if somebody else does, and I'm just not aware of it, but it doesn't seem clear at all to me on what we're basing that off of. And I think if we're going to move forward, then we ought to determine that and either, decide that we're going to be consistent on all plans moving forward of this is how we handle the issue.
I don't know if Casey has his camera on, if he wanted to address that or if he wanted me to speak to that.
Well, yeah, I think this is a fair question. And to be honest, I think the reason that the treatment has varied is it's depended on, how focused the council was and how focused the residents were in any particular area. About some have been very insistent that they wanted standards that had a lot, not just a lot of specificity, but a lot of teeth to them. And in other cases, I think that we've been successful in persuading folks that there's a benefit to allowing some flexibility. And obviously, if you write it into the plan, it's much more locked in than if it's in a separate document. I mean, there's ways to write it in the plan that can give you some flexibility in the way that you articulate the standards that are expected. In general, I think we'd like to get away from being hyper specific in the actual master plan documents and try to keep it out of the plan. But I think that we've tried to accommodate some of concerns by varying the degree of specificity in the plan based on the area. But I think you're asking a fair question, which is what is the approach across the county, and really should it be different depending on how engaged the neighbors are in any particular neighborhood?
Well, and I would just also add, it's not only about public participation. I truly believe there are different kinds of plans.
Exactly.
There are plans that cover literally thousands of acres and have, a dozen or more development sites. And we are dealing with multiple different kinds of design issues. There have been, in my time here, probably, again, 4 or 5 very small area plans. I've mentioned Burtonsville and Ashton. Also, when we did the Aspen Hill Minor Master Plan Amendment, which you may or may not remember, when we did the Grosvenor Strathmore Amendment, each of those deals with a very, very small geographic area with very specific design issues that have come up with a limited number of development sites within the plan area. And, so I would say what had been mentioned earlier, I believe by Councilmember Reamer, is sometimes there are plans where design is really baked into the essence of why you're doing a plan. It's not a big transportation plan. It's not a big land use plan. It's really about a very small area, and design is really baked in. And I think that the plans that I've mentioned have been like that. I think this is a plan that's like that, and that it's appropriate in those cases in the past and in this case currently to actually have the design guidelines be part of the plan. But, I think that those don't come up that often. And so I guess I wouldn't call it inconsistent. I think it's a matter of thinking about what kind of plan is it? Is it really a big sector plan, or is it really a minor master plan amendment dealing with a very limited geographic area?
Well, I'd be fine with that if we said on minor master plan amendments, we, and here's the rationale behind it. I don't think we have a consistent, coherent, policy or standard for that. And I think, unfortunately, it creates the impression that certain communities get certain input and other communities get less input. Certainly, I don't believe that that is the case, but that's the perception that we're creating. And I think it's a deeply unfortunate perception that we're helping to create because there isn't a consistent process here. So I would make a strong push that we adopt a consistent process. And I think, I think taking the thought process that you have just laid out and then looking at it on a broad scale and say, okay, when is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? When is it reasonable? So it's not based on if enough people show up in a particular community, then they get something. And if other people don't show up in another community, they don't get something, or, based on the council being particularly engaged on a particular item, or not. I mean, I just don't think that that is the best way for us to be doing business. So I hopefully we can address that moving forward. On this, my concern is this. There are a number of aspects in here, like the question of the length of buildings. Now, I can't recall a scenario at the council policy level when we have weighed in on the length of a building. I mean, that seems to me to be a highly specific item that seems not appropriate for this type of process. It just, perhaps I'm wrong about that, but, I'm certainly new to land use. This is the one area of government that I have, had no, formal experience in my previous government jobs. But that is not something that I'm used to seeing. That's not something that I am familiar with. And I do think that we're delving into some areas here that are generally taken up at different parts of the regulatory review process that allows for community input, that allows for, specific rendering. It's hard for me to determine whether an 80-foot width or a 90-foot width is better because there are trade-offs to that, including the height. If you're trying to fit a certain number of units into a building and you have a wider building, then you potentially could have a lower height. And in certain parts of the development, that might be desired by both the applicant and by neighboring community members and other key stakeholders who are involved in the process. I'm not in a position, at least personally, to make that determination without more specifics as to what the particular site plan review is going to look like. And I didn't think that that was the council's role in this. So I'm just a little bit, I tend to side with council staff on this, that, I'd prefer that it, not be included for that reason, because I don't think that it's helpful either to the community or to the applicant process, the application process. But I'll yield to Chair Reamer, and I'd like to hear from you, Gwen, on that.
Yeah. Well, I'll reiterate what Gwen said. There are different kinds of plans. This is a minor master plan, and the minor master plan functionality is relatively new. And so I think we are, inventing it as we proceed. And so I think it is inevitable that if you're going to do a minor master plan for an area like this, then you're going to get into those issues.
How are we determining that this is a minor master plan?
Not.
It's a sector plan.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So and this is, and I don't mean to be argumentative, and I apologize, but it's the point that I'm trying to make, that it isn't clear. So if that were the case, and we said all minor master plans do this and all sector plans do this, and all, the purpose of this is to be context driven. That's why we do, the master planning process is intentional in the sense that it allows for us to understand that all communities are not created equally, for good and for bad, frankly. But and that context should be a driving factor into consideration of land use, which should be contextual and should be adaptive to the neighboring and surrounding areas, and reflective of environmental, transportation, other key factors. But it should be a system that is set up that is consistent in the way that we address those land use considerations related to design and height and width and uses. And I'm not clear. It doesn't pass the town hall test. I can't go to a town hall and explain
So I
why
hear
we're
your
doing it
comment,
this way versus another way.
and we can come up with, I think, what you're saying, which is accurate, is that we need to make things that we, I guess, in the planning department consider implicit, we need to make them explicit. And we can come back to you with a policy about this. We have been consistent in that all of the small plans that I've mentioned to you, and some of them weren't called minor master plan amendments. Sandy Spring was called a village plan. Burtonsville, they were called different names, and we can come back to you with a written policy that explains it a little more logically and consistently. But we have been consistent in that all of those plans that I just mentioned to you have included the design guidelines in the body of the document. And I will, commit that we can, develop a written policy to help explain that a little more explicitly. In terms of the building widths, the only reason that we get into it in these design guidelines for this particular plan is that the mass of the buildings is very important. You can have a 35-foot tall building, and if it's really long, it still feels quite massive and out of character with the rest of Ashton. So mass is created by a combination of height, width, and bulk. And that has to do with the sloped roofs versus flat roofs that we discussed earlier. That's sort of how you get to an architectural massing. It has to do with, again, height, width, and sort of the bulk of a building. And so through these guidelines, what we're trying to do is actually replicate what is existing in the Ashton Sandy Spring community. And our staff, we literally, went out and measured buildings. We went out and looked at what exists in these communities. And that's where we came up with some of these width issues to help try to make sure, and it's where we came up with some of our height suggestions, which are incorporated into figure 10. And it's where we came up with the issue about flat roofs versus sloped roofs. It's all part of a package. It's not, one individual thing is going to make or break everything. It's sort of part of a package to end up with buildings that are going to look like they really fit into the context of the community.
Yeah, I think that, I agree with everything that you've said. I'm just not certain, and I'm not in a position to make the decision here, nor do I think it really is the standard role of the council, of that broad-based overview of, being context-driven to the surrounding community is something that we would normally approve. Saying that what that translates to is 80 feet in length in certain areas and 120 feet of length of a building in other areas, that is height and density are normally the things that we focus on. The width of a building it is not. And so this is where I have a little bit of heart. I understand that where the community is coming from, and we talk about in transportation land use about the breaks in a block having significant context, right? A super block being different than a small blocks and creating more of an urban feel. That makes a difference. I think there's reasonableness that there's a similar dynamic with building width, but what that building width could or should be and what the trade-offs are with heights and with market demands, I'm not sure. And I think, we do run the risk here as well of, if you set a design guideline and say 80 feet width, but then there are creative solutions to address community needs, and if you violate the guideline, it creates the standard that that this process isn't as buttoned up and uniform as we're stating it would be. I think to a certain extent we're setting ourselves up for failure, and I'm a little concerned about the position that puts everybody in, including the planning board, that in the community, and the expectations that we're setting for the community, that are these requirements, or are they guidelines? We're including very specific things and then saying that they're guidelines with the intention that we're going to depart from them potentially, which is understandably a very frustrating thing for community members who feel like they spend months and months and months, maybe years, weighing in on master plans to get certain decisions to be made, only for them to be departed from through the regulatory review process because of other considerations, and particularly with something like the width of a building, which I think is a very specific recommendation that is very contextual based on where that building is and how it's situated. I think it's very challenging for us to be including in the plan, at least from my perspective.
I think our problem is, if we don't set numbers, we don't get it. And this isn't the first, we aren't inventing this issue with this particular project. I'll give you an example with Bethesda. We debated long and hard with the Bethesda design guidelines about what tower separations should be between buildings, about what setbacks should be. And there's very specific language there, and there are distances given, 45 feet, 60 feet for tower separations, 10 feet to 15 feet for setbacks. And I will tell you that if we didn't have those numbers in those design guidelines, we have to fight very hard to even get those numbers now. If we didn't have those numbers, we would be having proposals for no tower separations and no setbacks, and there would be always a good reason and a good exception as to why it was appropriate. And so we really, I will tell you, as someone who gets involved in the regulatory review process, we need numbers, because otherwise we are having very, very contentious, difficult arguments. And I think if you're concerned that the community would be disappointed without these standards, I can assure you that they would be even more disappointed if there are no standards, and that we are really having to review and fight on every individual regulatory case that comes up.
Can I just add? So what I just heard you say is you have these numbers and you have them in the Bethesda design guidelines, which is not in the plan. And when I looked at the Sandy Spring plan, where there are design recommendations, they are, as Councilmember Friedson says, they are not setting out numbers for building width. They are not as detailed and prescriptive as the design guidelines that then might appear for some other location where they are outside the plan. And I think part of that reasoning is, if something occurs that is a best practice change, or you run into some specific locational uniqueness that causes a problem, the planning board in a very public process can make a modification to design guidelines. But once it's in the plan, you have to go through the minor master plan amendment process. If in fact somebody comes forward and says, okay, you did specify an 80-foot building width here, and I just can't accommodate that with the type of parking structure that I need to put underneath of it, because we don't want big parking lots associated with this building. Or that's just I'm just drawing some hypothetical example, but when they've been in the plan, I don't think they've included numbers. And so that was why council staff was just a little concerned that we're kind of doing both here. We're not only just putting it in the plan, but we're also putting in numbers. And I think that's where Councilmember Friedson was concerned. You're asking the council to make a recommendation on something that's possibly beyond what should be in the plan. Now, should it have numbers? Now, the only testimony we did receive on this was from the property owner of this area. And they asked for some more flexibility with that. They asked for a slightly wider width along the street for residential buildings, 10 feet greater, 90 instead of 80. And then interior to the site, they asked for, again, greater building widths, 150 instead of 120. Again, it's hard for council members to know whether, well, are those appropriate? They are going to be now numbers. And if they remain in the plan, and I understand why the community really wants the guidelines, we will not call them guidelines, design recommendations in the plan, possibly that flexibility should be considered. And in addition, we did receive another piece of correspondence, and I had missed it. It was in the testimony that did request to put a sentence in about allowing for the planning board to approve some alternative design should it come up as better and is agreed upon as a better way to implement the master plan. Because again, if these are in the master plan, they're not going to change unless you open the plan up. And we know that when something's approved, it takes many years to feel comfortable reopening that plan.
And I would agree that if you feel like there needs to be some additional flexibility, that the language that would be appropriate is not to take away the 80 foot and 120 foot, but to perhaps add a sentence saying that the board could consider alternative designs if they met the intent of the vision of the plan. I will tell you, one of the reasons that the numbers are in there is that when we saw the build out of the Sandy Spring plan, one of the biggest problems was the bulk and mass of some of the new buildings that were built in Sandy Spring. And it's what the people in that community feel has been a failure and has really hurt the character of Sandy Spring. And one of the ways we were able to counter it a bit with the units that faced on 108 was by breaking a long stick of townhouses into two separate sticks and having a gap, some space in between. And the community agreed that was, successful. So again, it goes back to that idea I mentioned that building width, building height, it all forms bulk and mass. The shape of the roof, that's what forms bulk and mass. And so we're trying to get that appropriate bulk and mass by talking about these specific dimensions. However, I think Ms. Dunn's point is a good point, which is that, there's always the exception that proves the rule. And, maybe there will be a time when there's an alternative design proposal that should be considered. So I think a sentence adding that could make a lot of sense.
All right.
Yeah, well, so I guess here's my concern. If I agree with the point that and the intention here, which is, and with the community concern, which is to avoid the super block, right? I said, we focus a lot on this in the transportation aspect. The same is true on the, building aspect, and language to say that we're going to avoid the super block, or however that is framed from a land use and architectural perspective. That makes sense to me. Saying that what that means is this number of feet width, I'm not sure whether that satisfies it or not. And I do have concern. What we're basically now talking about is we're saying we're going to have very strict, extremely specific recommendations in here related to areas of land use that the council normally does not get into at this stage of the process in this exercise. And then we're going to include language that says, but if the planning board thinks that there's a better way to do it, they can ignore that and do something else. And to me, those two things don't set up for a process that people are going to like. And it sets an unreasonable expectation with a lot of wiggle room, which creates the contention that we hear about repeatedly, which is we set a standard and then we provide an exemption, and the exception becomes the rule. And that is, you know, if we set a standard that is too stringent, and then we allow for exceptions to be made based on market realities, based on changing architectural dynamics, you know, based on all of those things, we have now set up a situation where we're basically using the exception in lieu of the rule. And I don't think that is a particularly good idea here. So I prefer to go with the staff recommendation and not include it. I think that putting in very specific recommendations and then adding language to say that if planning board believes that there's a better way to do this, they should just go ahead and do that. We should set what the goal is to avoid without the specific to say that this is exactly what that means, and then allow it to be interpreted through the regulatory process where the community is going to have the ability to weigh in, and we're going to get to the community input part of this later and dictate based on the actual site plan of what that means, what it looks like, and whether or not it reflects the goals set forth in the plan for the community, and whether or not it's appropriate land use based on what was set forth through this process.
All right. I don't particularly see a huge difference between the amount of effort we occasionally put into building heights at a particular location or the amount of effort in this case we would be putting into building width in a particular location. I think it's about putting an envelope over the, you know, prospective development, and that's often the, you know, that is the true friction point very often in a lot of these plans. So
could I just respond? The difference to me, and I just to make sure that I'm being clear, there is a difference because height, like a setback in other environments, is a specific requirement. You cannot exceed the height unless X, Y, or Z, you know, there's bonus density, there are other, you know, ways to go above the height, but it is set, and it is not a guideline. It's not a recommendation. It is the allowable land use as legally set forth. That is what you have the right to do. And you have by right ability to develop. You have other abilities to develop. There are regulatory review process that are set off based on going above those. Those are very specific, and they're specific for a reason, and there's no wiggle room. Here we're saying we have an overarching thing that we're trying to avoid in order to maintain the broader goals of the master plan. And we've set extremely specific numbers of how to accomplish that are set forth in a master plan that can only be undone in a master plan. And then we're potentially going to add language that says, but if there's another way to do this, go ahead and do that.
Well, we don't have to add that.
Those two things don't work together.
We don't have to add the you know, the language that says the planning board could consider something different. I'm okay leaving that out too. I mean, that was an effort to hedge against the potential implication of some of the specificity, but I don't know how important it is to do that. I think they could do something very successful with the fairly specific recommendations in the plan. I mean, I think what we've received here is highly workable, and I think you'll end up getting a great proposal.
Well, I don't think that it should be included in the plan. That's where I'm coming down.
All right. Well, we okay. Well, we're sort of stalemated then. So when you say should be included, do you mean the design guidelines in general, or do you mean that specific?
I mean, I agree with the staff recommendation as, you know, noted in the packet.
So council staff suggests removing the design guidelines from the sector plan.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, retaining.
Right. I recommended that they be the separate document that they are in almost all other master plans, but that, and you can retain the current planning board's recommendations on building widths that way. They stay in there. They are as strong as all the other design recommendations and other design guidelines, like you just heard in Bethesda, very specific design guideline recommendations in the Bethesda guidelines, so that the planning board has the strength to ask for things as they come in for site plan review. You would have the same strength and design guidelines for Ashton in a separate document, because they're obviously working in Bethesda. Although I'm not insensitive to the fact that the community feels like they are even stronger in a master plan, but they are. But again, you know, these building width things, this is very specific. But you could also add that, and again, we're going to get to this next. It's really about, can we also have the Ashton Village Center Implementation Advisory Committee, you know, involved. If any change were made to the design guidelines, a recommended change, you know, they are immediately get involved in that. And they're also involved in the design or the review process for projects. So we'll talk next about this implementation committee, but it is where they will actually have involvement in ongoing development proposals for the whole Ashton area.
Yeah, and just to be clear, at least as it is currently written, that the width of the buildings is not a requirement. It is a design guideline. And so I just point out that I think the best way to address the community concerns is to deal with the implementation advisory group, have that be a, you know, real and significant part of the ongoing planning process to make sure that the issues that have been raised by the community are addressed as part of the regular process. I just think that is the better way to do it, where we're not setting too stringent or unrealistic expectations where there's no trade-offs. Because in land use, there are a lot of trade-offs. The only thing we don't trade off are the things that we say, your right is to go to this height, your right is to go to this density, your right is to go to this type of use in this type of zone. You know, other than that, there are trade-offs that, you know, is usually through the site plan and other regulatory review process.
Okay, well, I guess we sort of stalemate here. So you know, to Pam, on page 16, you presented two options to the committee.
Mm-hmm.
Option one, remove the design guidelines from the plan. They would remain guidelines, but they would basically be an appendix. Or option two, keep them in the plan, make them design recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add a second bullet, which is consider, you know, increasing the widths for the testimony that was received. So that is, you know, and that led to the other language about, you know, if it's consistent with the plan. So, all right, well, it sounds like, so I am fine keeping them as design guidelines and making them design recommendations. And I don't think we need to additionally add the widths. I understand, you know, that has been requested, but I think that a great set of buildings can be done within with the footprint that, you know, was contemplated, unless the planning board felt strongly that that was a mistake, in which case I would say, oh, okay, understood.
I mean, I have to say that I think the widths are really important. And if the option is put the guidelines as a separate document, but keep those widths specified, I would recommend keep it as a separate document, but have the widths specified.
So just to be clear, Gwen, you're saying that the widths that are in the plan that we received are important. And so
yes.
Testimony that we've received to change those widths, you don't support that request.
Correct.
Right, and I agree with that.
But if what Councilmember Friedson is saying is that he feels uncomfortable with the idea of the widths being actually in the plan, because that gives them a kind of development standard that isn't typically part of the land use planning process, then I would prefer to put them in, but as a separate document, and not have any language. Again, I think Councilmember Friedson was not supportive of having any language about, allowing the board to do an alternative review of some alternative solution. I think if I'm correct, Councilmember Friedson, that you're essentially saying you're okay with this as long as it is a separate document, not within the plan.
Yes, and that way it could be adjusted outside of the minor master plan amendment as well, if it needs to be reduced or there could be changes as well. And there'd be a public process at the planning board to do that. Am I understanding that correctly as well?
Yeah.
Yes, I think if that is the direction you're going to have the design guidelines as a separate document, there should just still be a reference within the plan itself that says there are separate design guidelines in a separate document, which should be given, great weight in the review of any regulatory project or something like that. Because again, I will tell you, 10 or 15 years from now, the staff will have a hard time finding that 8-page design guideline document. And if it's not referenced in the plan to send them off looking for it, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I agree that it needs to have language that would reference it.
Well,
I also would be fine if we included language of what the design guidelines are attempting to do, from a broad bit, because to me, that is supposed to be what our role is here. So if the goal is to, avoid the super blocks or do whatever the case may be, I'd be fine with that too, if there was interest from planning and doing that.
And there's actually a page in the plan that's called Design Vision. It's page 87 in the plan. And perhaps the idea of that could stay in the plan as the design vision. And then there could be some language added to that referencing the fact that there are design guidelines in a separate document to be used in any regulatory case.
okay, again, we have done plans before that have design recommendations. Why are we setting up a new policy right here on the go? I'm not gonna say on the fly, but why is it so important that we not have these as part of the master plan?
We're not setting up a new policy. We're operating the complete absence of any policy at all on how we handle these issues.
But there's an implied policy vision here that they shouldn't be in these plans, or else there wouldn't be any reason to take it out. And there is precedent to have them in. And I just don't.
If there's precedent to have them in, there's more precedent to not.
Well, I'm not
have
so
them in.
sure.
I just think this speaks to the issue that I was raising in the beginning, that we don't have any coherent policy here.
But Gwen says that we do, and I tend to think that she's right, that the smaller plans, the smaller area plans are basically, there is a practice of having a higher design focus in those smaller area plans. And I think it's necessary. It's how you grease the wheels of doing these projects in these small areas where intensity is pretty high, and it's intensity over very, very precise issues. And if we don't have that ability to do that, it's going to be harder to succeed with these plans. I think it's just part of the political balance with the community that I always find that the smaller the geography of a political conversation, the harder it is. And like when we talk about the whole county, things can tend to move smoothly. When we talk about what's going to be right over there, conversations get really, really fraught. And I think the intent of this framework is that when we're talking about smaller areas, it's appropriate to have a heightened, application of design for the policy. So I'm generally comfortable with that. It's not been spelled out in writing as that is the policy. It sounds like that is the practice. But again, that's what Gwen says is the practice. Is there a disagreement that that has been the practice, and or that it should be?
To be honest, I think there has been some variation over time. I think it's what Gwen is saying is true as far as it goes, that recently we've had a number of small plans that have incorporated some pretty specific design standards, but I can think of some since I've been here that were pretty small, like Chevy Chase Lake comes to mind, where the design guidelines were not in the plan. So I don't have any religious views on this one way or the other. I mean, I think that the important insight is that if you're going to put it in the plan, it needs to be a little bit more flexible. You need to be a little more careful because you can't change it until you do a new master plan, and therefore you either better be absolutely sure about what standards you want to apply or write the standards in such a way that they have some breathing room in them. I think you can put it in the plan, but if you're going to do that, you want to think hard about exactly how to articulate the standards in terms of their flexibility and also foreseeing unforeseen possibilities down the road. It's easier in a small plan because if you only got one property owner like we do here, who realistically is going to be, in control of almost all the land that could be developed, then that helps because then you can sort of have a back and forth during the master plan process. But that's not something maybe you can write into any policy. What I'm saying is you could go either way, but if you're going to put it in the plan, just be mindful about the fact you're locked in. That's, to me, the main thing to keep in mind.
Which is the plan that you gave us.
Yes. And we felt like, the standards that we put in there, including the length of the building, were important, but it's not the only way that you could skin this.
And I will note that the drawings that the I'm already into the regulatory process, that the property owner submitted that Ms. Dunn pulled up recently, we did confirm that all of those images met the building widths and heights that we've talked about. Their buildings were 80 feet and 120 feet. So it's clear that it's possible to do it. I think that what everyone is saying is we just want to, hedge our bets in case we have an issue that comes up and we need to, make it 81 feet, or something like that.
I'm sorry, are you saying that that's what you're seeking?
No, that's what the applicant is seeking. We support the planning board draft.
Right. I mean, I know the applicant would like more flexibility. Applicants generally would like, more entitlement, more allowance, more flexibility. I understand that, However, I think in this case, we've gone through a careful process. I don't see a reason to change that at this point.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
In the absence of the applicant's requested language, which gives, it says here's a very strict guideline, and then gives the planning board the ability to ignore the guideline if there are other ways to achieve the same overarching policy objectives and goals, right? I mean, that's essentially what it does. It's very strict with lots of wiggle room to get out of it if you need to, right? I mean, that's essentially the thought process. Does the planning board or planning staff feel that without that language, that the planning board already has that authority and ability to approve, ultimately approve under this plan a project that exceeds the length as described?
I
just heard the planning board chair say is if you're going to include this, make sure there's some flexibility here. And then I have planning staff saying we don't want flexibility because we very specifically came up with these numbers for a very intentional reason with a very specific planning and zoning objective in mind. And this is why I'm uncomfortable with us including this, because those two things are not congruent to me.
Well, I think
unless I'm mishearing.
I think there's a way to reconcile these things. Okay. I think what Gwen is saying, and I agree with it, is that if you leave it completely open-ended, the applicant will come in and say, Where does it say I can't have a building that's 200 feet long? You must approve this project because it says nowhere in the zoning code or in the master plan that I can't build this building in this envelope. And it creates it puts a lot of pressure on the staff to recommend approval of a project that is not optimal, okay? So that does not mean that the master plan must say buildings must be limited to X feet. What it does mean is that if you're going to put it in the plan and you think it's important, as I do and as the board did and I think the staff does, there's ways to write that in such a way that clearly gives the staff and the board the authority to limit those lengths along with the lines that are laid out there in terms of number of feet, and still accommodates the possibility of an escape hatch. So it says, look, we think these buildings should be chopped up because a really long building at these heights could get really oppressive. And therefore, applicants should go into this process understanding that we can and will say no if we feel like the combination of those heights and lengths that they're proposing is not in keeping with sound design and the rural character of Ashland. You can also, at the same time, provide a little bit of flexibility to say if somebody wants to build a 22-foot townhouse instead of a 20-foot townhouse, that's not absolutely prohibited. I think there is a way to reconcile these things. They're not as inconsistent as they sound. It's more avoiding the kind of reductio ad absurdum of it has to be all one way or all the other. We need to create some expectations to give the staff room to get leverage on the applicant during the development review process, but we also can accommodate within reason a little bit of flexibility there. So
And do we believe that exists with the planning board language, or we believe that that is, I mean, maybe this is a question for Ms. Dunn, or do we believe that that would only be accomplished, as the planning board chair is suggesting, with the requested language that you had shared with us earlier from the property owner?
Again, I do think this kind of delves into the realm of the regulatory world. And so in talking to planning staff, I don't think it was 100% clear. There is a paragraph on page 89 of the plan, which is really under the chapter on design, that is talking about these building widths. Slightly misplaced. It should be under building massing. But the point is that the language reads that the buildings along the state roads should be 80 feet in width or less. And that multi-use and general buildings may be up to 120 feet along the state road. So it like makes this distinction about what type of building you're building if you're, and then talks about mixed use tenants. It's a little confusing. You know, their impression was it would be hard pressed to get above these limitations as a, you know, when the projects come in for review. And given we had testimony from the property developer who was concerned with the 80 feet, wanting it to 90, possibly that is an issue. But I'm also hearing the director say that she feels 80 is, you know, workable and what it should be. So it's.
Is there a way to just put the word approximately before 80 and the word approximately before 120, leave the language in as it is, but add the word approximately? So if a plan comes up where they need 81 feet, there's an opportunity for the board to approve that. And, you know, but that the goal of essentially keeping it in that general realm of 80 feet is still clear.
Well,
Approximately sounds really.
approximately sounds like 85 feet or 90 feet,
what-
you know? Because I don't understand, like, why are we spending, like, the property owner has asked for this. The planning process that we've presented consciously believes in a different building width. And I support that. I know the property owners requested a lot of different things. I think we have a good recommendation before us on that particular issue. So I don't know why I think they can live.
Well, planning, I'm not worried about the property owner. I'm addressing the the difference between what the planning staff has said, what the planning board chair has said, and what our council staff, has recommended here. I mean, that's what I am
And I have
trying to reconcile and address. I mean, I think you're focusing on, because the truth is, this isn't about the property owner versus the residents, because the residents are asking for something even more specific and even more rigid here. They're asking for no flexibility at all.
Let me ask Pam.
That this be a requirement, not a recommendation. That is what the community is asking for here.
Right. Pam, did you find some compelling reason that the building width issue needed to have more flexibility, or, did you identify something that may not have been considered?
The only thing that I saw, so I saw three things. I did go back. I looked at other master plans. I looked at design guidelines from other master plans that had been approved recently, trying to get context for what was being recommended for this one. And the only three things that gave me pause were the fact that, so Sandy Spring, there are no numbers associated with those design guidelines. They are definitely important and they provide context for how things ought to be built, but there weren't specific numbers. In this case, you have three things in this design guidelines that present numbers. You have the width of a stoop. That's probably not that big a deal. We doubt that like any best practice might change that. But again, what if a property owner owns just a single house and wants to put a stoop, but it has to be a certain size? And maybe that everyone's fine with that. The other is that there's a multiplex building defined in these guidelines and it has a certain number of units. Is that going to be restrictive? I think it's up to, I can't remember, 18 or 16. It's a number of units at the high end is what's called a multiplex building. What if somebody wanted to build a multiplex building and it was 2 more units? But they couldn't build those because, well, the design guidelines in the plan, this master plan recommendation that you have to have master plan consistency with says a multiplex building only has X number of units. And then the third was this place where there are the building widths. And a building developer could come forward and say, I need 85 feet to make this work. I need 82 feet. Would they be able to do that? Or would the plan say, but the master plan for consistency says you must be up to 80 feet. And so, like I said, I looked at the bulk of things that had been approved in the last decade. And as the director Wright has said, yeah, the Bethesda plan is very specific about a lot of things, but they are guidelines so that if best practices change or they find they're unbuildable, they can go through a public process to make that correction. Sandy Spring included them. Grosvenor Strathmore included them, but they were a little bit higher level. So it was just that conflict between seeing something more specific in this plan and seeing it in the plan. So I recommended they should be treated like the other ones and made as an appendix, but leave them the way they're written, right? If you're gonna keep them, if you're gonna make them an appendix, if you're gonna pull them out of the plan, don't change them at all, because this is what the planning board and planning staff have said, make the right community. And then they could only technically get changed under a public process. They're in the plan and need changed. It's a minor master plan process, which we know is very different. That's
You're not recommending a specifically different building width or any of that. You're just saying put them into a appendix.
correct.
Not in. All right.
Right. I didn't say to increase them if you're putting them in the appendix. I think they should stay as the planning board sent them over.
Okay. That's helpful. Well, okay. Well,
And we just list this as 1-1. I mean, and move on.
I know. Well, I
think we're both,
I hate to do it because I know if we do it that way, we're going to end up with a lengthy discussion and debate at the full council. And it would be preferable to resolve this at the committee in a way that is going to not be able to resolve that. And I don't know where Councilmember Joanna would be on this one. He said he was broadly with the staff recommendation. But I think, I think we should say it's 1-1 for now. And we'll obviously consult with, we'll hear what Councilmember Joanna's view is. We may come back to this before it goes to full council. Maybe there's some additional creative language. This one is a little bit of a black and white issue as to whether it stays in. So I don't know how much nuance we can add, but okay.
All right, we're gonna move on. Moving on, The last piece that we really have to talk about for this plan is the implementation piece. And the only piece within the implementation that I think was really called out, and as we've already referenced today a few times, is this recommendation for an implementation advisory committee. And the planning department is really great with these, and they've done them in other master plan areas. Olney has one. The Great Seneca Science Corridor has an implementation advisory committee. Basically, the master plan recommends the committee, gives it some framework for the fact that it's going to get created and what it oversees, and that its involvement is really at the earliest stages of the development process. That's what the community is asking for, that they don't just create a committee that comes and sits at the table for an application review, but that when an applicant is even considering something, that the advisory committee is alerted to that. And so there can be a dialogue very early in the process. After the plan gets adopted, then basically there's a charter that gets written up to really form this committee. What does it look like? How does it operate? And who is on it? The other recommendation is that the plan language be modified just a little bit. It really calls out one specific group in the Ashton area to be included in this advisory group and to work with the regional service center. I would just recommend we don't recommend any specific group at all. You have 5 different civic and neighborhood groups that provided testimony. And I don't think we should list one over the other. So I would just broaden that language a little bit and then allow the membership of that group to be something that's comes out through its charter and that the planning board is very familiar with doing. And they always include a member from every civic and neighborhood group within the community around one of these advisory committees. They do that really well.
Yes, I agree with your recommendation there. I mean, civic, like the Ashton Alliance may be strong today. It could be that the lead organizer stops working on this in 2 years, and that happens a lot. So it could be something different. It could be the Ashton Coalition in the future. So I think it makes more sense to not. And the testimony of all the groups will be in the public record. And so when it comes to figuring out, reconstructing what groups should participate, there's a very clear record to draw from.
Yep. Right. And that's pretty much it then.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just point out all of the comments that we're talking about before in terms of community input. Strengthening this group and this group's role, to me, is the best mechanism in order to do that through the regulatory review process. I just wanted to note that because the conversation devolved a little bit into, whether we agreed with the 90 versus the 120 or whatever the case may be, or 80 versus 90, and not as much into the question of whether or not having a number at all made sense in that context, which is really, I think, the intention of the staff recommendation and my reasoning for supporting the staff recommendation on the previous issue.
Fair point. We weren't, it's now clearer that we weren't actually trying to decide whether the building should be one particular width or another. They are written into the design guidelines as a certain width. And, the suggestion was make them make it an appendix that could be changed with additional public process rather than the kind of more ironclad master plan recommendation, but it wasn't to actually have a different width.
Right.
No one actually proposed a different width. I think that was probably a confusing point of that discussion, but it was also the rationale. It was presented as a rationale for why it would be better to have as an appendix, in case that number was incorrect. All right, so I think that concludes this then, Pam, and we will hold this and not send it on to full council. And we will,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Councilmember Reamer. We do have a second work session that was put on the schedule for this in case we didn't cover everything. It is the 19th of this month. It could give you time to back for a 15-minute item to clarify the one thing that's 1-1 with Council.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Okay, very good. And Gwen, if you could please do a little more thinking about, master plans and the design issue, and maybe for the 19th, you could share with us a framework of what you think policy could be, and maybe that will help, enlighten that conversation, and we could find more consensus there. All right, because that's really the only outstanding issue is how do we go forward on that basis. So, all right.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I do appreciate the broader, explicit policy on how design guidelines are handled to come back to us and propose, because I think that will be helpful moving forward to clarify this. And it could be, both, how it's included and in what plans it would be included.
Well, do you think, Gwen, you could have that ready for the 19th?
Yes, I mean, I can lay out essentially what I almost, said in this discussion as to what our practice has been and lay that out as, really as a policy. And as I mentioned, there are, both practical reasons for doing it, as well, because again, in these small plans, the guidelines are 1 or 2 pages long, or 3 or 4 pages long versus the whole booklet. And there are also policy and substantive reasons to do it, because I think, as Councilmember Reamer said, these smaller plans have a very heavy design focus. And it's appropriate to put these more detailed design guidelines in the smaller plans to reflect that detailed design focus. So we can certainly lay that out.
All right, we'll have that conversation on the 19th and see how that goes. All right, I don't think we're going to get to the Heritage Gardens ZTA today. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to adjourn for the day, but that was a very good discussion. A lot of work went into that plan, and we got through 99% of it. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Very substantive conversation today. So with that, thank you. We will adjourn for the day, and apologies we couldn't get to the second item. All right, thank you.